Hello, podcast people. Now, just before we start this episode properly, I wanted to give a reminder to the 1% or less of people listening to this who are in the Paris area or who will be in Paris on the 19th of July. Is that you? Paris, 19th of July, 2024. I'm doing a stand-up comedy show. It's a two-man show with my friend Charles Pellegrin. I'll be doing half an hour of stand-up comedy. Charles will be doing half an hour too. Come and join us. Have a good laugh. It's a 100% English show. Here are the details. So the title is Luke and Charles, Same Difference at the French Fried Comedy Night. 8:30 p.m, 19th of July 2024. The venue is called, in an English accent, Au Soleil de la Butte, 32 Rue Muller in the 18th arrondissement of Paris. Entry is free, but we encourage you to buy a drink when you arrive, which will make the owners of the bar happy, which is what we want. Reserving tickets isn't possible yet because the event still isn't listed on the website Eventbrite. After the stand-up comedy show, I'm hoping to record a live podcast episode in the room, so you can join me for that too. This is not confirmed yet, but I would like to do it. In any case, if you want to come and see me performing stand-up comedy live on stage, this is a good show for you to come to. Enjoy the show. Let us entertain you with our jokes and our stories. Have a drink afterwards and say hi and hang out a bit and maybe be part of my audience for a live podcast recording too. 19th of July, 2024, 8:30 p.m, Au Soleil de la Butte in the 18th arrondissement of Paris. All the details are available at teacherluke.co.uk/comedy. Hello listeners, welcome back to Luke's English Podcast. Today I'm talking to Rob from the Business English Podcast, which is also part of the Energetic English channel on YouTube. And we're going to talk about networking and how to network effectively in order to help your business prospects and your career. More on that later. First of all, let's say hello to Rob. Hi, Rob. How are you?
Hi, Luke. Very well. What about yourself, sir?
Not bad, thank you. It's quite a nice sunny day today, which always makes everything better. Blue sky, sunshine, so everything's fine. Yeah.
Can't complain. That's not too bad. Obviously not UK side then, because we have our overcast umbrella up today.
Oh, really? Overcast? Yeah.
Yes, overcast.
Typical conditions. Grey, overcast sky. Is that it?
Yeah, feeling typically British though, so this is good news. Good news. I feel ready for some English today.
Yeah, it's not actually raining then. This is...
Yeah, we've been spoilt actually. Yeah, it must be said. We've been spoilt. It's not raining at all.
Okay, good. So Rob, just let's get to know you a little bit before we actually get into the subject of the episode today.
Sure.
So Rob, where are you from actually?
So originally from York, about 2 hours north of London by train in the north of England. It was a long time ago. It was the capital, I think, when the Vikings were here. Very nice old city, but that's where I'm from. So do excuse my northern plummy accent if I do drop any syllables today.
So York in Yorkshire.
Yes, this is it. Yes.
I hadn't really picked up on a Yorkshire accent that much, to be honest, in your voice.
I'm very pleased. Occasionally, a client might say, "Where are you from?" This sort of like an interrogating question. Where are you from? And I think, oh, maybe I said something. Maybe the vowel sound was a little bit too strong.
I don't know. I really like a Yorkshire accent. In fact, my whole family, we all come from Yorkshire. Not me personally, but my parents both come from Yorkshire.
Really? Whereabouts do you know specifically?
Mum in the Barnsley area. My dad from the Leeds area.
Excellent. Yeah, Barnsley. We're just down the road from Barnsley, actually.
Really?
So on the outskirts of Sheffield now. So I returned home like a boomerang, around the world, travelling and working, and then returned back to Yorkshire, the county. Previous career, I was dealing with or interfacing with the international community, presentations, meetings, and that took me to South America, many countries, most countries in Europe, the Far East, sort of Southeast Asia area, bit of North Africa. So a really good flavour of how we communicate on an international level, when businesses and money and things are changing hands internationally. I really got some good exposure in that way. So very interesting. Yeah.
And did that kind of inspire you to then start doing a business English podcast? Is that the reason?
Yeah, I mean, this is where it came up. It came up during that time. Sort of did about a decade within the space, and discovering that there was actually a point of sort of contention or friction when we had the non-native English professionals displaying ideas or giving presentations, negotiating or networking, and it was always a thought of mine about could could they use a little bit more in order to get their points across? So, a lot of the frustration was them not having access to the right phrases or the right terminology in order to truly hit the points. I mean, they got the points across, don't get me wrong, but there was this idea of, I think they could go one level further. And it was often in the networking in the bar or something afterwards, it was always sort of like, sorry for my English. And it was absolutely, something I thought, well, we might have something here. So this is, we have the mission statement, Business English Podcast. It's for non-native English professionals in offices worldwide suffering lives of quiet desperation with their professional communication sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, having worked as an English teacher for a long time, I've taught lots of business English as well. And I've spent time with people in companies and worked alongside people who, as you said, have to use English, that they're forced to use it in fairly high pressure situations, in meetings, in negotiations, doing presentations, writing emails, and having to build relationships in English. And it can be very stressful for them because of a lot of different reasons. One of which is that they feel a lot of pressure to be perfect, and there's status involved in that. But also just being able to do the job effectively in another language.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. The onus on the non-native to operate, fairly complex environments in a second language. I always, I really think this kudos to them. It's a great position for them to be in. That they can actually command respect and actually function a business in their second language when we're, we haven't left go. We're still in our native tongue. We're not operating on their territory at all. And so I always think, it's a really great thing for that other individual. Okay, they may be dissatisfied with some areas of it, but they are working in their second language. And I think that is an amazing thing, and it should be acknowledged. Yeah,
I agree. And we talk about the fact that non-native speakers have some work to do in terms of kind of like working on their English and stuff. Another question, maybe for another topic for another time, is also native speakers, I think, in this situation also have some responsibility, right, in terms of understanding what our non-native counterparts are dealing with, and about grading our English, like choosing the right kind of English when speaking in those situations.
That's right, Yeah, absolutely. Finding calibrating against your audience. I think we'll go into it later, but just having a good idea. It's like you said, a responsibility of the native to actually regulate your speed, your vocabulary usage, and read the room, because you have access to probably far more vocabulary than the other individual, and so the onus is on you to make sure that you're not walking into a proverbial minefield.
Yeah, exactly. I guess the spirit of it is, in these situations that everyone has to try to adapt themselves to the situation in order to use this language in an appropriate way, for the situation. And that's kind of what we're talking about here, right? I mean, it's business English. Your show is called the Business English Podcast.
Right.
What about business English? What do you think people associate with the idea of business English?
Yes, it's a great question. I often liken the difference, business English in general, to something like the Wizard of Oz. It's sort of like this mysterious thing, kind of intimidating, kind of powerful, but peeking behind the curtain reveals something far less scary, actually. It's a bit of a paradox.
What's the paradox then?
Well, on the one hand, you have something that's not really that intimidating because it uses the same phrases, the same vocabulary as general English. The same rules apply, more or less, which means general English speakers will be able to make a very strong, very good, solid start into the world of business English. You already have all the components available. That said, on the other hand, you have this sort of, there's a difference, although you're using the same vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation. These things are still very much important, but you have, contextual accuracy. You really need to understand the context, the dynamics that you're operating within, the audience, how direct you're going to be, the formality. All these things need to be taken into consideration. And when you do that, you appreciate the dynamics of what you're trying to communicate. And therefore, this allows you to operate in much higher pressure, as you said before, scenarios like meetings, presentations, interviews, negotiation, all these things.
Contextual accuracy, this is an interesting term.
Yes.
Like the idea that the context defines the way in which you use English. And another way of putting it would be pragmatics, or being pragmatic in English. And that is the idea that the way that you put certain things has certain effects on the people you're talking to. And that relates to things like being diplomatic, being direct, being indirect, being polite, maybe in things like negotiations, applying pressure or exploring options. It all comes down to sort of the way that you structure language, the certain vocab that you use. I mean, we're going to look at some examples. But that would include things like, the way we ask questions when we're getting to know people, just, whether we go in with a direct question or an indirect question, and what's the actual effect of doing that. These are exactly the sorts of things we're going to be talking about. Do you have any examples, actually, just before we get into the subject of networking, do you have any examples of moments when business English should have been used, and it would have been better if a certain kind of business English had been used, and general English was used instead?
I think this is quite a good question to open us up here. So, where I've been in a number of positions where this could have taken a much more positive turn had business English been used. Although not always essential, general English can get the job done. But I was in a presentation, it wasn't too long ago, it was being delivered by a junior analyst. The audience was fairly senior. I happened to know that the junior analyst came from a culture where they communicate more directly. From an English standpoint, they're much more of a direct culture when they communicate in their native tongue. And so through the presentation, the junior analyst to the senior audience is telling them to wait, or what, to repeat a question, or tell me now, in terms of, would you mind elaborating on that answer? And it was just building the friction in the air. You could feel that the audience weren't comfortable with the sort of questioning. It was a great presentation. He knew his stuff. But the idea of just changing that communication would have actually taken all that friction and tension out of the air. And I think the presentation would have gone even better for the individual. If you see what I mean.
Yeah, so the point was that he was giving this presentation, a junior analyst. So I guess this is someone whose job it was to analyze some data or something and then present his findings to the audience. He was junior, which means he was sort of younger, maybe a newer member of the company, presenting to senior members. And so there just needs to be a certain level of kind of formality or respect, a respectful tone there. And he was just kind of being a bit too direct and maybe a bit too informal, and saying, wait, and saying what, and tell me more. And he, as you said, he should have been saying things like, just hold on for a moment. Sorry, would you be able to elaborate on that? And that's exactly what we're talking about. Instead of saying, tell me more, the difference between saying, tell me more to a group of people and would you mind elaborating on that? This is exactly the difference that we're talking about. So tell me more is so straight and direct and to the point, and can be perfect in certain situations. But would you mind elaborating on that? Kind of shows respect. It's a bit more. It shows a bit more restraint. It's less direct. It's a little bit more formal. It's just the appropriate thing to say in that situation.
Yeah, it definitely feels better. Takes off all the sharp corners, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. And those people would have expected a certain level of. People like that need a certain level of treatment, a certain kind of respect.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, there's a conversation going on that no one's talking about, and that is, this should be more formal. And I think because he sort of missed the mark in that regard, the presentation could have gone much smoother for him. But he wasn't playing by the rules, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. From my side, most of my time has been spent working with learners of English. In business English situations sometimes, and I've just seen it so many times, and not just with like younger learners. Where I used to do a business course called Young Business English, and it would be like university age learners. But I also have taught much more experienced people too, and so many times I've been working with people, and I've given them a role play situation, for example. So it could be a meeting or a negotiation or a networking situation. And having worked on it, having worked on language and stuff, and then give them the task and just watch as the students just like operated without using the right kind of behavioral codes. Not just struggling to find the right language for the situation, but just applying themselves with a certain kind of behavior. And that's kind of what this is about as much as anything else. It's about applying yourself with certain behavioral codes, knowing the right codes for the right situation, and how that translates into the way that we use language. And so, it's definitely some people don't realise. I mean, we've worked in communication for a long time, so we're very familiar with this. But a lot of people go into these situations unaware of how to apply themselves. So let's talk about networking then, shall we? That's the idea today.
Yes, I think that segues beautifully into perhaps there is no greater scenario that demands eloquence or at least some skillful use of business English than networking. And I believe you're definitely the man for networking.
You think?
Fantastic. Oh, absolutely.
It's interesting you say that, because when we were preparing for this episode, I was trying to think to myself, what examples can I give of networking myself? And, since I'm a English teacher, really, podcaster, do a few other things, I just kind of thought I don't really have that much experience of networking, but then again, maybe I do. And I kind of realised that as an English teacher, there's a lot of networking involved in that. We should probably talk about what networking is actually from the beginning. It's basically the way that we socialise in English, the way that we strike up conversations with people that we probably don't know very well. And the purpose for doing it is to make connections with other professionals that will hopefully lead to more opportunities for future projects, future work, and open doors professionally, basically. So it's really about spontaneous speaking, good listening, social English. The aim of networking is to open up the lines of communication and to build relationships with people. A lot of the time, as I said, it involves meeting people, talking to people for the first time, talking to people you don't know that well. Yeah. And it involves a certain mindset, a certain approach, a certain amount of cultural awareness, some key phrases and language structures, and the pronunciation of those structures. Right?
Yes. I think that is an excellent description, an all-encompassing one, but really about that building and maintaining relationships, like you said, being the real core element of networking. And to your point about being an educator within the professional space, I think we have to be good at this element, because if we don't have a connection with the students or clients that we are imparting our knowledge upon, then you just don't get that rapport. You need to have a rapport with your audience or your clients or your students. So again, it's one of those unspoken things that it's just assumed. I don't think any teachers in normal schools are, how good's your networking skills? Well, it's actually a core element to a lesser or greater extent, because if you can't build the rapport with the class, so to speak, then you might be in trouble.
Yeah, we might associate networking with sort of like business people in suits in a certain industry or something, but in fact, we all do it to an extent. It's it's just something that everyone does, and maybe we don't even realise we're doing it. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So what about the power of networking English? Do you want to talk about how networking in English can do things for us?
I believe, taking it from a standpoint of two strangers in a room, or, we've just been kicked out at coffee break of a very long and dull presentation by the financial department or whatever it is. We've never met before. And so we both rock up to the coffee or the caffeine dispenser in the foyer. And we now have this human requirements, call it subconsciously or the caveman in us. We need to interact in some level. Somebody's got to say something, otherwise we're going to feel this tension for a long time, this awkward situation. And I believe that networking from this moment is required, even if it's just a polite hello or how are you or some other phrase, just to get that tension out of the air immediately. So I guess that would be one point, is about removing the tension. What do you think about that?
I completely agree. And I also think that this is where perhaps a lot of people start to they want to run screaming from the building at this point, because for a lot of people the idea of networking is just not attractive to them, and a lot of people think, it's not for me. This is for the extroverts, this is for the people who are outgoing and stuff like that, and a lot of people have a negative association with this whole idea, that they would rather just curl up into a ball with their mobile phone and their coffee and just like forget the rest of the world. I think it's completely normal to feel, as you said, awkward in this situation. But it doesn't have to be. And I think it's when you realize that everyone sort of feels the same way. If you can kind of change your attitude and make it more about, rather than it being a performance where you're worried about being judged, it's more an opportunity for you to discover some new people and find out some interesting things from others. And if we put it in that way, if we become curious about the people that we have in front of us, then that suddenly makes it much more easy and much easier, and there's less pressure involved, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Taking the friction or the pressure out of the environment is one of the key components of having building a good relationship from the get-go. Going back to the example of being stood at the coffee machine, we need to make sure that the other person, and again, I think maybe it goes back to, is this other person a threat? We're a caveman, we need to start communicating, show, hey, we're good. We nearly fell asleep too during that presentation. It was boring, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. And you're looking for that point of connection, I think is absolutely paramount within networking. And this is where it falls over, in my experience, with most non-native professionals. It's like, well, where do I start? Okay, what do I do? Ask them how they are, or about what they did at the weekend, or how much money they earn. It's like, well, okay, we need to do some guidance on this.
Okay, so what do you suggest then? What should someone say in that situation?
With networking from a cold start, the advice I always try to impart is go for something that you're both sharing. Now, that is the experience. It could be the weather. It could be the presentation. It could be the coffee, but something that is shared between you. Go for that shared experience to break the ice and get going. It doesn't need to be, and I think it comes from maybe nerves or previous English lessons or something. If somebody came up to me and said, "Hello, how are you? My name is Rob," it feels quite square. It's like, okay, that's nice. Mm-hmm. It would feel much more natural if I'd walked up to you, Luke, during the break and gone, "God, the coffee's strong, isn't it?" No introduction required, no anything, and the ball is rolling, and it just lays the floor open for you to engage. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. So talk about something neutral, something that you both have in common, and a comment on the situation is a great idea, and a comment that has no kind of value judgment to it, really. I mean, you can comment on the coffee, that's okay, but not necessarily commenting on the presentation or whatever the situation is. We're at a conference or we're at some sort of business meeting or something like that. Not necessarily making some judgment about the situation, but commenting on something neutral that you both share Exactly. So that can include things like, the coffee. It can just be a simple sorry, do you know how this works? Or what do you think of the coffee? Or or just some comment like that. Try and keep it positive. I generally find that it's good to keep things as positive as possible in that situation to avoid getting into any negative spaces. But you can talk about the weather. I mean, that's always fine. If there's something to say, like, chilly, isn't it? A bit cold, isn't it today? That's certainly in the UK. You can never go wrong with that. Or comment on the room that you're in, and say, wow, this is the new building there, and I haven't been here before. It's impressive, isn't it?
Yeah.
And little things like that with tag questions on the end, like, it's a bit cold, isn't it? This is an impressive room, isn't it? Or coffee's very strong, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's the tag question element at the end, just to open up that like a game of tennis. You're serving the ball back to the person. And I think the onus is on the other person not to keep hold of the tennis ball, but to actually return it again to get this momentum into the conversation.
Yes.
But, asking the tag question, is the coffee great? It then gives me the opportunity to give you my opinion about the coffee, and that, the milk is great or organic. I can then segue into something else. I can then transition into, is it your first time here? Or wasn't the last presentation wonderful? Or I can't wait to see the keynote speaker today.
Right.
And it just allows the whole conversation to open up, rather than fighting through those initial sentences of, well, I've worked here for 5 years and, I know Sally in the HR department, and it's all a bit square. You want the brakes to come off as soon as possible. And I think this is the magic of networking, is if you can get those initial first questions and opening lines right, you get the momentum.
It might be difficult in a business situation, but for me, I always sort of see those situations as a chance to kind of have a little bit of fun. And I actually want to entertain. I want people around me to be in a good mood. I want people to be enjoying themselves.
Yes.
And so I can kind of just, I don't know how to describe it really, but just start to be a little bit light-hearted about neutral things. It's hard to give an example of that, but there are biscuits available, and I might say, lovely biscuits. God, I love these biscuits.
Yeah.
Even something like that. And then, as you say, from there, once you've broken the ice, then you can start to get into the actually the proper stuff, which is where you're kind of saying, so is this your first time at the conference? Or how do you know Rob? Which is always a good one when you've got someone in common. How do you know Rob? Do you work together? Or have you seen any other interesting talks here so far? Did you have to travel far to come here? Which company are you with? And then there's obviously, what do you do? What do you do there? And most of those questions I asked, is this your first time? How do you know Rob? Do you work together? Have you seen any other interesting talks? Mm-hmm. Most of those questions are all actually closed questions.
Yes.
Which is interesting, because we always assume that open questions are going to be the better ones. But I've noticed that closed questions they're actually more polite. And the other person has to understand that they're not being invited to give a simple yes or no answer. Like, for example, is this your first time here? No, I've been here before. Wrong.
Conversation killer.
Yeah. So is this your first time here? No, I've been here several times before. In fact, last year was my first one. Were you here last year? You've got to be willing to share a little bit as well.
I mean, it's a great observation about there is a responsibility for the other person in networking. I mean, the networking is being conducted by both individuals, the listener and the speaker. Listener needs to be prepared to really understand the content of the question, but then to open it up and keep like we said about that game of tennis, keep the game going. And so the other person has an opportunity to listen to your perspective, because if it's a one-way conversation, that's normally a monologue, not a conversation, which is never fun, actually, to be on the receiving end of a monologue.
No.
So any experiences of, really good networking scenarios for yourself, ever situations?
Oh, I don't know. I think, again, going back to my experience as a teacher, often what we would have in a school I worked at in London, we'd have
Sure.
day one, which would be a Monday, and tons of new students in the school. And at the end of the day, there would be a drink, literally bottles of beer and soft drinks available in the main room of the school. And the students would be invited to come and chat with each other. And I mean, it's obviously because everything was happening in English, because I was a teacher and a native speaker, but I would find in those situations I'd be doing a lot of heavy lifting.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Where you're like, so did you have to travel far to get here? And then just like the person gives their answer. Okay, so, is this your first time in London? Answer. And it's just like, just having to carry the whole conversation.
100%.
You know, you want it to be a double-sided thing where both people are taking responsibility for maintaining the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a really pertinent point that you were saying about you having to do that heavy lifting. And, you know, I take it wasn't with native English individuals.
No, not in this case. So that's, as I said, it's probably because of the English, you know, and the status, because I was the teacher and because they were operating in English, they would, day one, they would often be a bit sort of shy. Yeah. But
no, I was going to drop on that point about this cross-cultural communication, and you know, it's a nice sort of transition into something else we could talk about here. Is this reaching across cultural bound? Okay, everybody's speaking in English, that's fine, but you might be flavoring this English with your communication style from your cultural perspective. And so I know that some of my clients from regions of the world, it is perfectly acceptable to interrupt somebody, like just talk over the top of them, because that's what happens. But you must remember that although we are speaking in English, there are certain rules and regulations, should we say, very British, we must abide by whilst conducting this networking. And so cross-cultural communication is absolutely massive in terms of business English. I mean, have you got any thoughts on cross-cultural communication, interruptions, etc.?
There's just so many things. Like you said, it is huge. It's a huge thing that everyone needs to be aware of. And it's really mainly a question of mindset, of just being aware that there are all these invisible factors at work. And these are factors which might influence the way that the impression that you get of someone, that you might think that they're being very quiet or that they don't have anything to say, but it might just be that you haven't really unlocked them properly, you know? But the people who write about this sort of stuff, the kind of academics or whatever, the people who study cross-cultural awareness and stuff, often what they do is they divide these national traits or these cultural traits or behaviors into these sort of poles or extremes, and normally most cultures exist somewhere on a scale between those two things, right? So I've got some examples of these sorts of scales. You've got like outgoing and informal versus private and reserved.
Great.
So you find some cultures are just generally a lot more talkative and social, and other cultures tend to be a bit more reserved and quiet at the beginning. And what might be good at this point, Rob, is if we consider certain examples of cultures we know well. We could maybe think of English, like England, and then another culture. I mean, I live in France, so I could probably comment about the French, but I don't know if there's someone else, another kind of cultural group that you could think of at any point.
Maybe Polish. I have a tremendous amount of clients and interaction with Poland. Do a lot of work with the businesses there and professionals there. So probably, yes, Polish would be Poland would be a good one.
So I don't know where each of these cultures exist on this outgoing and informal to kind of private and reserved scale. I don't know. What do you think?
In terms of the Polish communication style, I don't know how I would approach it, but I would probably say urgency in terms of delivery of message, in terms of the way they conduct business is about this urgency. So if something needs to be done, something needs to be said, it needs to happen now, yesterday, in fact, in some cases. And it's a communication style that works very well with business. However, if you're in a if you're a mediator, if there needs to be more sensitive or delicate dialogue being conducted. It's a transition that may need some balancing. I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, so that kind of to the pointness, the like being very straight and to the point, which suggests that maybe that like people from that area might want to take examples from sort of, I don't know, I think of like Latin cultures or maybe like South American people who tend to be a lot more kind of gregarious or outgoing. I mean, I don't want to make any generalizations, but I mean, you know, having worked with many people from many countries, I have noticed that obviously, you know, people from Brazil tend to be a lot more outgoing than people from certain other places. I think the French are probably a bit more outgoing, a bit more informal, but having said that, they have quite a lot of formality in these situations. Another category would be the kind of scale of live to work versus work to live. So some cultures seem to put a lot of status on your work. Your professional achievement defines who you are, your job defines who you are, and then other cultures are a bit more focused on the personal fulfillment, and that life is more important than the imposition of your job. And that's certainly true in France. They're definitely on the side of the live to work side of things, to the point that it's less common in France for people to open a conversation with, so what do you do?
Yes.
In the UK, that's just like, we just get straight in with, so what do you do? But in France, it's like less common, and people I've noticed will introduce themselves with personal information first. They'll say their age, they'll say whether they have children, you know, they talk about their family life a bit more. Whereas in the UK, we're just like straight in with like, what is your job? You know, this is how we define ourselves.
Yeah. I think it's a paradox in many ways as well with the British, because there is nothing that annoys, as English natives, you and I find that nothing annoys other cultures, literally every other culture in the world that is not a native English nation, is our indifference, our having to read between the lines. I mean, what are we actually saying? And the cultures that communicate directly, it really winds them up.
Oh yeah,
and I completely sympathise with this communication style, because I think it really ties us in knots. I mean, isn't it? Is it or isn't it? You know, is it black or white? Is it, you know, up or down? But it's not. It's grey. It's in the middle. It's soft and mushy. I think this is a real challenge, even for natives, to decipher this sort of hedging element. And so for those direct the cultures that communicate directly, it really presents a challenge for them.
That's a really good point, because again, that's another scale of like direct to indirect, or saying, you know, someone says exactly what they mean versus someone talks expecting the other person to decode what they've said. Because in the UK, we can be a bit indirect, and other cultures too are famously quite indirect, like the Japanese, for example, where other people sometimes say they don't know what their Japanese counterparts actually think, you know, and it's actually the Japanese or British people are communicating with different codes. So if for example, you show me something and I say, well, you know, like the example I always give is when my wife, who's French, wants to go to the castle where my parents live, and we're emailing, and she says, oh, you know, I'd like to go to the castle. My dad replies by saying, well, we could go to the castle, but... And she thinks we're going to the castle. I'm like, what are you crazy? Of course we're not going. You know, did we read the same email? Because I can decode, we could go to the castle, but that means that actually we don't really want to go to the castle. Just my dad just doesn't want to be rude. He just wants to keep things nice. And so, direct cultures, and France is a more direct culture than Britain. And so, the French can get a bit annoyed by this. Like, what do you really think? Just say what you think, for goodness sake. And the Brits are like, we're just trying to be nice. We're just trying to keep things nice, you know? Like, you know, that's what we're trying to do. And so the intention is to keep things sweet. And we're always trying to sugarcoat things, you know, but for direct cultures, it can be confusing that you don't know exactly what we think, but it's just because no one knows how to read between the lines of each other's communication style.
Yeah, agreed. and I think it comes up a lot in networking. When you're asking another individual about where they're from or what have they been doing, and if you get this soft response of nothingness, you find it difficult to latch on to anything, because you need something, you need a focal point in that networking conversation to hold on to, the coffee, the temperature, the keynote speaker, whatever it is. But if you're not really laying anything down for the other person, that makes it very hard work for them to, like you said, do all the heavy lifting and fight through that networking situation.
But it's also worth remembering that when you're talking to a person, if you're starting to ask them for their opinion on a thing, you might actually be making it very difficult for them, because they might feel like, I'm not in a position to give my opinion on something. Like, I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't have the right to give my opinion. And this is another thing. We have like opinion related cultures where everyone's opinion is heard and everyone's opinion is respected, and there's nothing wrong with it, versus more hierarchical ones where people know their place, and asking someone to give their opinion on the keynote speaker is a bit like putting them on the spot, and they will feel very uncomfortable about doing that. So you've got to understand that sometimes asking those direct questions can make people feel very uncomfortable. And so, there is an art to kind of like talking about nothing sometimes.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Great point. Absolutely great point. It reminds me, I was training a couple of individuals to come across from Southeast Asia to Cambridge. And we were doing the training for the interviews and things. And I was saying about, you've got to have an opinion here. Like, if somebody asks you your opinion, you have to present something and then give a reason why. And, a couple of examples. Why is the sky blue? Or the sky is blue, like making a statement. And their response would be something like, oh, yeah, well, I guess, it is sort of blue. Or it's the sky is multicolored. And like, oh, yeah, well, I guess it is. They weren't challenging anything. And I said, well, in the British culture, we have debating societies. So even the most ridiculously obvious thing will be debated at length. It's almost like a sport.
Yeah.
You come down to the debating club and you debate it. And it's, again, going back to the cross-cultural communication, it's something that is almost inherent in our communication style in English, is that things are sort of debated and pulled apart a little bit, and maybe sometimes your opinion is sought. But I completely, agree with you about, it would be uncomfortable for cultures where they don't provide their opinion. They want to be reserved. They want to keep their cards close to their chest. They won't communicate in this way, and that's certainly worth bearing in mind. Yeah.
Yeah. So you got to be able to read the room, read the people you're talking to. And there's all the non-verbal stuff as well, and that includes things like the way that we interact with other people's personal space. In some cultures, they will stand quite close to each other. There might be physical contact. In other cultures, there is a lot more distance. In some cultures, there's like this sort of macro level body language where everything's very demonstrative and expressive. And then other cultures where their body language is much more minimal and yet still significant. So little facial expressions or small touches can say as much as someone gesticulating with their hands. And things like eye contact.
Eye contact, yeah.
Some cultures, it's a sign. It's like a sign of strength and integrity to make eye contact and hold someone's eye contact, whereas in other cultures that's challenging. You don't do that. That's like a challenge, and you don't expect someone to hold your eye as well, because they don't want to feel they're challenging you.
Yes.
And a lot of other things. The way we exchange business cards.
Yeah, exchanging business cards. Yeah, that's a good one. Do we still have business? I mean, we're in the era of Bluetooth and stuff. But yeah, no, people do definitely. They go armed with business cards. In the arena at networking, just throwing them like Chinese throwing stars. Sometimes it's very intense.
I think maybe we don't have business cards anymore. I can't remember the last time someone gave me their business cards. To be fair.
Yes. Yeah.
But anyway, there's loads of other things. So you've got formality in names versus informality in names, expressive versus restrained body language,
Yes.
Large personal space versus close personal space, personal fulfillment. So putting your individual, sort of talking about what you want and what you want to achieve, putting that as a priority over like the group fulfillment. And some cultures are much more collective in the way that they see things. Merit, so emphasizing someone's merit, what they've achieved and what they've earned, versus kind of someone's standing in their group. Welcoming risk, avoiding risk, being innovative versus being traditional, disagreeing openly versus more subtle disagreement, multitasking versus linear tasking, and then also food, like the way that we deal with food. Yeah,
absolutely.
So lunchtime, for example, what's sort of lunchtime in the UK in an office environment? What's it look like?
Well, I mean, if you're working in an office, I mean, some people do a working lunch, don't they? They just eat their sandwich over their keyboard, and it all gets quite messy quite quickly. But in some other cultures, this would be seen as like obscene, insulting in some ways, and that lunch should be taken in an establishment that is geared up for eating. You wouldn't bring something as delicious as food into work and mix it with your technology. It's absurd.
So there's that. There's the kind of hygiene angle. But actually, from the French point of view, the idea of just eating a sandwich at your computer is kind of like it's sort of a bit sad. But also, from a sort of HR point of view, from the human resources management, sort of like the employees' rights, human rights angle, it's actually it shouldn't be allowed, like that every member of staff has the right to at least 1 hour and a proper lunch, hopefully provided by the company in the company cafeteria, a 3-course meal, plus coffee at the end. So when I've worked at French companies teaching English, you often end up in the cafeteria at lunchtime, and it's like a 90-minute lunch. I used to teach at the airports, so at Charles de Gaulle and Orly airports. I used to go and teach the various members of staff who worked there, and I would always be brought into the back of the airport where there was a huge cafeteria, and there's like it's unbelievable, Rob. And it's not just the airports. It's like loads of other companies in Paris have got the same thing. These cafeterias, these huge cafeterias, and there's different queues. So there's one for the kind of meat counter. There's one for the pizza area. There's one for the salad bar. There's all these different options, and you can have a 3-course meal plus cheese. And wine as well.
And wine as well.
Yeah, there would be mini bottles of wine available, red and white. So there's these guys working at the airport eating a full 3-course meal with a salad bowl and cheese and a dessert, like a chocolate mousse dessert, and they're drinking glasses of wine at lunchtime at the airport.
Wow. I mean, talk about like cross culture. I mean, this couldn't happen in the UK. I mean, what do you sleep for the rest of the afternoon after this 3-course meal?
Well, no, you drink loads of coffee, really strong coffee afterwards.
I just sleep all afternoon afterwards. I'm not sure you can do this, wine at lunchtime in the UK. I think some people may take it a step too far.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, it doesn't happen all the time in France, but it's definitely true. You definitely see wine, and some people are taking it. Not that everyone does that. But yeah, in the UK, it's not uncommon to just sit at your computer with a sandwich.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's that might be just normal. And so other staff would be almost expected to be answering emails maybe at lunchtime and to be available. But in France and similar cultures, lunchtime is when you do not do work. You socialize. Yeah,
I like that. I'm very much on side of with that idea. Is this something that we'll be doing after the podcast today? Then perhaps we'll go out to a wine bar somewhere and.
I'll take you to the Luke's English Podcast cafeteria where we have a range of different foods available. There's sushi, there's whatever you want, just name it. You can get a kebab, fish and chips, whatever you want.
What an experience.
Yeah. And so, so basically these national or cultural differences, every culture exists somewhere, on each scale. And so it's worth just thinking about these things if you're going to be doing business with another culture. Educate yourself about the culture. There's normally a lot of literature, a lot of stuff that's been written in terms of advice if you're doing business with certain places. Understand what you're going to be dealing with. Always be respectful. Always try to be positive about the other culture. Go into these situations as a curious person who's really open to learning about other cultures. You can explore the fact that you're different. This is a great starting point where you compare one versus the other. Try not to criticize. I mean, I've had examples of students coming from different countries coming to London, and because they were experiencing so much culture shock, they couldn't help themselves. They couldn't help criticizing the situation that they were in. And talking about the food or the weather, complaining about the carpet in their homestay family's house. Talking, even I even had students talking about like the way that women in London dressed and sort of making these disparaging comments, and it's just absolutely terrible, really, to hear that kind of thing. So we when we experience culture shock, often it manifests itself as a kind of like, how do people live like this? How do you do this? And I've seen people having that conversation too, like, but what do you have for breakfast? That kind of tone is
100%.
No, it should just be like, oh, that's really interesting. Great. So, and do you have this for breakfast? It should be more curious rather than more like, I can't understand this. How do you justify your culture?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. Like you said, staying curious, staying inquisitive, I mean, is one of the bottom lines or the unspoken rules of communicating internationally. Like we've hammered already the point. If you're speaking in English, yes, that's half the job, but you now have an obligation to approach everything with an open mind because you're now on the international stage being judged by all the non-native speakers interacting in that ecosystem. So having the child's mind, staying inquisitive, enjoying these new miraculous ideas and discoveries that you may encounter, I think this is very, very important.
Yeah. Yeah, it's you've got to try and take the right approach and be curious and open and so on. What else, Rob? What else can we add in terms of networking? It's a very big subject.
I would sort of bring it to a head or draw it to a close in some ways by providing like a singular concept of being inquisitive, like we just mentioned. Stay inquisitive and be open-minded about whatever is happening. I mean, networking, you can't network with yourself. So by definition, there's always at least one other party involved. And it's some sort of technique that I teach on a lot of my courses or seminars if I'm doing any sort of education at scale. It's called a spotlight technique. And that is basically throwing that spotlight onto the other person. And it is a game of you push it on them, and then they push it back on you. And you are just constantly forcing this emphasis and spotlight on the other person by asking those open or closed questions and getting them to elaborate on points about whatever it may be. And something quite magic happens, I think, in that process of even if you say very little, the other person subconsciously is building that relationship with you because they're talking about where they were at the weekend and how long they've worked at the company, and they can leave that conversation feeling like they've got to know you very well because they've been the one disclosing this information to you, and it's quite an interesting thing.
Yeah, building trust. Yes, this is kind of active listening. Listening to what someone has said and just accepting what they've said and not putting any judgment on it, but being totally open to what they say. This really helps to make the other person feel trusted, which is like the basis of any good relationship. And active listening. So this means you listen to the person, but you show them that you're listening, and that's body language as well. Again, I'll give examples of students I've seen in class where I give speaking exercises, and this one student is back here. They ask a question, which I've provided, and the other student gives their answer, and they go, okay, next. Which is terrible. Instead what they should be doing is leaning in and kind of, sort of with some sort of open facial expression and listening to the person give their answer, and really showing that person that they are listening and taking on board what they're saying, and paraphrasing what they've said. So when someone has said something, you kind of like just sort of repeat it back to them, which again is a great way of showing that person that you're really taking on board what they've been saying.
That repeating back to that, I think they did some study in a restaurant, could have been in France actually, about repeating. The waiters there were two sort of set groups about this social experiment where the waiters were either not going to say anything at the end of got the order right and everything, but they delivered their food and drink, and the experience was very pleasant in the restaurant. But the second control group, the waiters were asked to repeat back the last three words that the client, the customer, had said, and they found some ridiculous increase in tips at the end of this experiment just by repeating the last couple of words that somebody says to you. You find this engagement experienced by the other person goes through the roof.
Absolutely, that's very interesting, and I do like it when waiters repeat my order back to me. So I say, I'll have this, and this, and they go, okay, so it's one of this, one that, okay, great. And because you feel like, okay, that person has actually taken on board what I said. They have listened, they got it right, and it just makes you feel a little bit more comfortable and taken care of.
Yes.
Now, we're not finished, Rob, because we're going to continue this conversation on your podcast.
Indeed we are.
Because there's more stuff that we can talk about in terms of networking. I think we've got into quite a lot of good stuff. We talked about the cross-cultural things. We talked about breaking the ice. We talked about the importance of active listening. We talked about certain conversation starters, the right kind of attitude that you should have about being curious and interested and fascinated in other people, and seeing networking not as a moment when you're going to be put on the spot, but really a chance to find out a lot about some new people that you have in front of you. So we've talked about quite a lot of stuff, but we're going to continue the conversation on your show. By the way, how do people find your show? How are they going to find this next part of our conversation?
So we are on all podcast platforms, and we are the Business English Podcast, or the businessenglishpodcast.com. We should hopefully still be on page one of a very popular search engine.
Okay. And I'll put a link in the description as well for the next part of this conversation. So listeners, you can just check the episode description. You'll find a link there, and that'll be what you'll need to do next. Okay. All right, Rob. Good.
Appreciate you having me on the show today, Luke. It's been an absolute blast. It's been fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been good to talk about this subject. I don't often talk about business English on my podcast, so it's really good to kind of get into the subject for a change. And I'm looking forward to part 2 of this.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. See you next time.
Okay, so that was Rob from the Business English Podcast. And if you want to listen to the second half of this conversation, because we continue to talk about it, as you just heard me mention, then you can listen to it on Rob's show, The Business English Podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts. Also, Rob's website, thebusinessenglishpodcast.com, if you want to hear the rest of our conversation about networking, and there are plenty of other comments and insights and bits of advice and stuff on that subject. Thanks again to Rob for contributing to this episode, and Rob took the time to prepare comments and questions and some structure for the episode, so that was really nice of him. I appreciate that. Thanks a lot, Rob, and everyone. So I hope you enjoyed this episode and found it to be useful. I think there was a lot of advice in there and a lot of comments around the subject of networking in English in an international context, and the things you need to consider, and some things you could do, and some specific things you can say when you're trying to, build relationships, start up conversations, and generally, get to know people either for work purposes because you're trying to expand your professional network, or maybe in non-business situations as well. If you're just trying to get to know people and just trying to expand your social circle. I think a lot of the stuff that we talked about is relevant to a variety of situations. Leave your comments in the comments section. I would like to know your thoughts on this whole subject. First of all, your experiences. Do you have experiences of networking in English internationally? Talk about them. What experiences do you have? What things have you learned about doing this? Do you have anything to add to the things that you heard Rob and I talking about? We'd love to know your thoughts, so just leave your thoughts in the comments section. But otherwise, I'll let you go ahead and listen to part 2 of this. Okay? All right then. This is basically it then. This is pretty much the end of the episode. And let's see. Thanks for the responses to last week's episode. It was nice to know that people enjoyed listening to that. That was the 3-hour plus ramble, which was called Still Raining, Still Rambling. It's no longer raining, but I am still rambling. Look, I'm still doing it. I can't stop, apparently. But yeah, it was nice to get some comments and stuff from people who enjoyed that episode. Let's see. A lot of people made it all the way through to the end, even though there was about 3 hours and 19 minutes of it. A lot of people made it to the end, and people were leaving comments about the piece of cake that was left on my desk for about 24 hours, not covered, not in a what do you call those boxes? Those plastic boxes? I can't remember. Tupperware. Not sealed inside a Tupperware box. Not put in the fridge. Not kept in a cool, dark place. Just left on my desk for about 24 hours, half eaten. A lot of people were wondering, what happened, Luke? What happened with the cake? Well, no, I didn't eat that. That went in the bin. The cake went in the bin. I didn't want to risk it. To be honest, the cake was already it wasn't the most delicious cake already. It was already a little bit dry anyway. But after all that time, it was just, I had a taste of it and I thought, no, I probably shouldn't risk it. I don't know. Is it a risk to eat a piece of cake that's been left out for 24 hours, 23 hours? Is that a risk? Probably not. It's probably not that deadly, is it? But anyway, I just didn't fancy it. So I thought, what am I going to do? I've got nothing to wrap it up in. I would take it home and wrap it up and take it home and then put it in the fridge and enjoy it with a cup of tea or something later. But I didn't have anything. The simple solution was just to get rid of it. So I'm really sorry to everyone who, for the cake lovers out there who are like, no, don't. You should never discard uneaten cake. It did go in the bin. But anyway, it was nice to see that a lot of people got to the end and they were leaving comments about the cake. Also about the music as well. It was nice to, talk about the guitars and stuff in this room and stuff like that and to do a song at the end. But you know what? I've got to stop doing songs on the podcast. I do. I have to stop doing them because you know why? Especially on YouTube, they get flagged. They get sort of copyright restrictions on them. Because obviously those songs are, the rights to those songs are owned by companies or people. And so if I sing a song on YouTube, then that episode often gets demonetized, which means that probably the record company who owns the rights to the song, they claim the right to monetize the video. So they say, you can publish this, but you can't monetize it. So every time I do that, I don't earn any revenue from those little automatic ads that you get. Or if you're a YouTube Premium subscriber, I also get a little tiny bit of revenue per view. But if there's a copyright restriction, then I get no money at all. So essentially just sort of podcasting for free whenever I do that, just for the pure love of the music. So I don't know. I don't think I should continue doing that. It's not wise, is it? Really, from not just a business point of view, just from every point of view. Why should that's going to cost me quite a lot of money. I need that money. I need to buy baguettes. and and stuff like that. So I don't know, maybe I need to start another YouTube channel. I have actually got another YouTube channel. I have actually already got one where I play music and just do cover versions and play along to songs on the bass guitar and stuff like that. So maybe in the future, if I want to do more songs, I could just do them on that channel, which which doesn't really make any money from ad revenue. There's about 12 subscribers on there because no one knows about it. The channel is called Ukulele. It's like ukulele, but Ukulele. You see what I did? I'll leave a link to it in the description. I mean, there's not very much there. There aren't really many things there at the moment. It's just a few kind of bass guitar videos. But I'll leave a link to that in the description, that maybe if I did songs, I could just put them on there instead, and that could be a separate thing. But anyway, what do you think? What do you think? It's a pity, isn't it, really? Because it's nice to sing songs. It's nice to do that. But maybe it's time to call it a day on the songs on the podcast. Which, again, also a pity, because I had several episodes planned all about certain songs where we would explore the lyrics and explore the story behind the song and stuff like that. I think it's okay to read out the lyrics, especially if I'm, doing it for educational purposes, like explaining the words and stuff. I think that's okay, but I wouldn't be able to actually play the song. Maybe it's for the best. Maybe it's for the best, because I wouldn't want to sort of destroy those otherwise beautiful pieces of music by doing my own special cover versions of them. So maybe it's for the best. Anyway, it's time for me to stop rambling, right? It stopped raining, so I should stop rambling and in fact go and eat some lunch. And I will not be having a 3-course meal with cheese and a side salad and a glass of wine. I'm not going to, people don't do that every day in France. I didn't want to give the impression that, for example, at the airports near Paris, that all the members of staff are getting drunk on wine. I mean, that's absolutely not the case, of course. But certainly wine is available, and it's normal in cafeterias that wine is available. But not everyone's drinking it, and people are very responsible. It's just like a small glass of wine, just to, this is the lifestyle in France. This is the way to live, isn't it? And it's not like in the UK where you have one drink and then you're like, whoa, let's go crazy, let's go out on the lash. And then everyone's binge drinking, and, it's like a Friday night in the town centre of any English town. No, in France they're a lot more controlled and reasonable about it. It's more just enjoying a nice moment and enjoying the taste of a nice glass of wine with your whatever French food that you're eating. Anyway, time for me to stop this now. Okay, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening to the podcast, it would be lovely if you could write a nice review of this show. Maybe if you're using Apple Podcasts, you could use the Apple Podcasts page to write a review of this show. That would be wonderful. It really helps. It helps massively if people leave reviews of the show. And so, yeah, all right, good, lovely. Have a lovely morning, afternoon, evening, night, wherever you are in the world. And I will speak to you next time. But for now, it's just time to say goodbye. Bye, 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 bye.